The Grand Metropolitan Hall was buzzing with life that evening. Hundreds of well-dressed guests filled the massive room, their laughter and conversations echoing off the high ceilings. Crystal chandeliers hung above them like frozen waterfalls, catching the light and throwing tiny rainbows across the polished marble floors. It was one of those fancy charity events where tickets cost more than most people earn in a month. Waiters in crisp white uniforms weaved through the crowd carrying trays of champagne and tiny appetizers that looked more like art than food. Women in designer gowns chatted in small groups while men in expensive suits discussed business deals between sips of aged whiskey. Everyone seemed to know everyone, or at least pretended to. This was high society at its finest, and the air practically crackled with wealth and privilege. Near the front of the room sat a magnificent grand piano, its black surface so perfectly polished, you could see your reflection in it. The Steinway had been specially chosen for tonight's performance, and it waited there like a sleeping giant, ready to come alive under the right hands. Victor Ashford stood near the bar, surrounded by admirers. He was the star of tonight's show, a concert pianist whose name appeared on posters in every major city around the world. At 42 years old, Victor had achieved what most musicians only dream about. He had performed at Carnegie Hall, the Sydney Opera House, and Royal Albert Hall. His albums sold millions of copies. Critics called him a genius, and perhaps all that success had gone to his head just a little bit. Victor was handsome in that polished way that comes with money and fame. His dark hair was perfectly styled. His tuxedo fit him like it had been painted on, and when he smiled, it was the kind of smile that knew it was being watched. He loved being the center of attention, loved the way people hung on his every word, loved the way they laughed at his jokes even when they weren't that funny. The secret, he was saying to a small group gathered around him, is not just playing the notes correctly. Any trained monkey can hit the right keys. It's about understanding the soul of the music, becoming one with the composer's vision. He took a sip of his drink, clearly enjoying himself. Of course, that kind of understanding takes years of dedication. Decades, really. Not everyone has what it takes. The people around him nodded enthusiastically, murmuring their agreement. Victor soaked it up like sunshine. As the evening wore on, the crowd began moving toward their seats. The performance would start soon, and everyone wanted a good view. The front rows were filled with donors who had paid premium prices for their tickets. Behind them sat the regular wealthy folks, and further back were a handful of guests who had received complimentary tickets through various community programs and charity initiatives. In the third row, slightly off to the side, sat a woman who looked distinctly out of place. Her name was Elena Rodriguez, and while she had dressed as nicely as she could, her simple black dress and modest jewelry made her stand out among all the designer labels and expensive accessories surrounding her. She was in her mid-50s with dark hair starting to show threads of silver, and kind eyes that held a certain sadness if you looked closely enough. Elena had received her ticket through a local community center where she volunteered on weekends. She taught piano to children whose families couldn't afford private lessons. When the center's director offered her the ticket, Elena had almost declined. Events like this weren't really her world anymore. But something had made her say yes. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the memory of who she used to be. Or maybe it was just fate. She sat quietly watching the crowd, feeling like an observer looking through a window into a life she once knew but no longer belonged to. Nobody paid her any attention, which was exactly how she preferred it. She had learned long ago that invisibility could be a gift. The lights began to dim and a hush fell over the audience. Victor made his way to the stage, walking with the confident stride of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. The spotlight found him, and he gave a small bow before sitting at the piano bench. He adjusted his position, cracked his knuckles once, and placed his hands over the keys. What followed was, by any objective measure, brilliant. Victor's fingers flew across the keyboard with precision and power. He played Chopin, then Liszt, each piece more technically demanding than the last. The music filled the hall and the audience sat transfixed. This was why Victor was famous. This was what all those years of practice and natural talent produced. When he finished his first set, the applause was thunderous. Victor stood and bowed deeply, that trademark smile spreading across his face. He soaked in the adoration like a plant soaking in rain. "Thank you," he said into the microphone after the applause died down. "You're too kind." I'll take a brief intermission before the second set, perhaps just 10 minutes to rest these hard-working fingers. As people stood to stretch their legs and refresh their drinks, Victor stepped off the stage and began moving through the crowd. He shook hands, accepted compliments, and basked in the attention. He was in his element, working the room like a politician at a fundraiser. That's when his eyes landed on Elena. She was still sitting in her seat, not mingling like everyone else. There was something about her stillness that caught his attention. Or maybe it was the way she looked so completely different from everyone else in the room. Whatever the reason, Victor found himself walking toward her, a mischievous idea forming in his mind. Now, it's important to understand that Victor wasn't a cruel person. Not really. He just enjoyed being clever, enjoyed making people laugh, enjoyed being the one everyone was talking about. And in that moment, with all the confidence and slight arrogance that comes from being celebrated and admired, he thought he'd create a little entertainment. "Excuse me, madam," Victor said loudly as he approached Elena, his voice carrying to the nearby tables. Several heads turned to watch. "I couldn't help but notice you sitting here so quietly. Tell me, do you play piano?" Elena looked up, startled to suddenly find herself the focus of attention. Her eyes met Victor's, and for a moment she seemed confused about why this famous pianist was talking to her. Yes, I used to," she said softly, so quietly that people had to lean in to hear her. Victor's smile widened. This was going to be good. "Wonderful. Then you simply must honor us with a performance. After all, we're all music lovers here, aren't we? I'm sure everyone would be delighted to hear you play." A ripple of laughter moved through the nearby guests. They could tell this was Victor being playful, having a bit of fun. The contrast was perfect. This world-famous pianist asking this ordinary-looking woman to perform. It was absurd, and absurdity was always entertaining at these kinds of events. Elena's face flushed red. Her hands gripped the armrests of her chair. Around her, people were smiling, waiting to see what would happen next. She could feel dozens of eyes on her, maybe hundreds. Her heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. Victor extended his hand toward her, still smiling that confident smile. He fully expected her to politely decline, to laugh it off, to give him a reason to make a gracious joke and move on with the evening. It would be a funny story, a moment of levity before he returned to serious artistry. But something happened that Victor didn't expect, something that would change everything. Elena took a deep breath, and slowly she stood up. For a moment, time seemed to stop. Elena stood there in the third row, her simple black dress a stark contrast to the glittering gowns around her. Victor's hand was still extended, that confident smile frozen on his face. But something in his expression was starting to shift. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. The woman was supposed to laugh nervously, wave her hand dismissively, and say something like, "Oh no, I couldn't possibly." Then Victor would insist once more for show she'd decline again, and he'd return to the stage with a charming story about trying to discover hidden talent in the audience. Everyone would chuckle, he'd finish his performance, and the evening would continue as planned. But Elena wasn't declining. She was standing, and the look in her eyes wasn't embarrassment or fear. It was something else entirely, something deeper. "I haven't played in front of people in a very long time," Elena said, her voice still quiet but somehow carrying across the suddenly silent room. Her Spanish accent became more pronounced when she was nervous. "My fingers are not what they used to be, but if you really want me to play, I will try." The atmosphere in the hall changed instantly. What had been light-hearted and amusing suddenly felt uncomfortable. People shifted in their seats. Some exchanged worried glances with their companions. A few women looked at Victor with expressions that clearly said, "What have you done?" Victor's smile faltered. He hadn't expected this. The joke was supposed to end with the woman saying no. Now he was stuck. If he backed out now, he'd look like a bully who picked on someone weaker than himself. But if he let her play, she'd probably embarrass herself in front of hundreds of people, and he'd still look like the bad guy. He was trapped by his own cleverness. Are you sure?" Victor asked, and for the first time that evening his voice lost some of its confident edge. "I mean, there's no pressure. It was just a friendly suggestion." Elena looked at him directly, and Victor saw something in her eyes that made him take a step back. It was like looking into deep water and realizing you have no idea how far down it goes. "I'm sure," she said simply. The walk from her seat to the stage felt like it took forever. Elena moved slowly, carefully, as if she were walking on ice that might crack beneath her feet. Every step seemed to require a conscious decision. People watched her in complete silence now. The earlier laughter had died away, replaced by an awkward tension that made everyone uncomfortable. Victor followed a few steps behind, his mind racing. How had this gotten so out of hand? He considered stopping her, making up some excuse about time or the schedule, but it was too late. She was already climbing the steps to the stage. The spotlight that had made Victor look like a star now felt harsh and exposing as Elena stepped into it. She looked small up there, dwarfed by the massive piano and the enormity of the space. Her hands were trembling visibly as she approached the instrument. Someone in the audience coughed, and it sounded like a gunshot in the silence. Elena stood beside the piano bench for a long moment, just staring at the keys. Her hand reached out and touched the polished surface, her fingers barely making contact, as if she were greeting an old friend she wasn't sure would remember her. Then she sat down. Victor stood off to the side, his arms crossed over his chest. He tried to keep his expression neutral, but inside he was cringing. He imagined her playing chopsticks or some simplified version of a Mozart piece, hitting wrong notes, losing the rhythm. He was already planning how to gracefully end this disaster and move on with the evening. Elena adjusted her position on the bench. She sat up straighter, her posture shifting into something more formal, more proper. Her trembling hands hovered over the keys, not touching them yet. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath, then another and another. The audience waited, the silence becoming almost unbearable. Some people started to feel sorry for her. This poor woman, clearly in over her head, about to humiliate herself because some famous pianist thought he was being funny. A few guests were already planning angry comments they'd post on social media about Victor's behavior. But then something strange happened. As Elena sat there with her eyes closed, breathing slowly, her whole body seemed to change. The tension in her shoulders melted away. Her trembling stopped. Her face, which had been tight with anxiety, relaxed into an expression of deep calm. It was like watching someone slip into a warm bath after a long, cold day. When her eyes opened, they were different, focused, clear, determined. Her hands lowered to the keys, and she began to play. The first notes were soft, almost questioning. They hung in the air like a gentle mist. Elena's touch was light, careful, as if she were testing whether the piano would respond to her after all these years. The melody was simple at first, just a few notes that seemed to be searching for something. Victor uncrossed his arms. His eyebrows drew together. That was actually quite good. The touch, the control, the way she was pulling sound from the instrument. This wasn't amateur playing. Then Elena's fingers began to move faster. The simple melody transformed into something more complex. Her left hand joined her right, creating harmonies that made people sit up straighter in their seats. The music was building, growing like a flower opening in time-lapse photography. And then, with a confidence that seemed to come from nowhere, Elena launched into Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2. The effect was immediate and stunning. This wasn't just competent playing. This was mastery. Her fingers flew across the keys with a speed and precision that made Victor's eyes widen in shock. The music poured out of the piano like water from a broken dam, powerful and overwhelming and absolutely beautiful. People in the audience gasped. Some leaned forward in their seats, unable to believe what they were hearing. Others reached for their phones, fingers fumbling to start recording. This couldn't be real. This ordinary-looking woman in her simple dress was playing one of the most technically difficult pieces in the classical repertoire, and she was playing it like she'd been born to do it. But it was more than just technical skill. What made the performance truly extraordinary was the emotion behind every note. Elena didn't just play the music. She felt it. She lived it. Every chord seemed to contain years of joy and pain, love and loss, hope and heartbreak. Tears began streaming down her face, but her hands never faltered. If anything, they seemed to move with even more purpose, more passion. Victor stood completely still, his mouth slightly open. All his arrogance, all his confidence, all his clever smugness had evaporated like morning dew. He was watching something he couldn't quite understand. This level of playing, this depth of interpretation, It took decades of training and practice and dedication. You didn't get this good by taking lessons at the local music school. You got this good by giving your entire life to music. Who was this woman? The music swelled and crashed like ocean waves, filling every corner of the grand hall. People who had been checking their phones or whispering to their neighbors were now completely absorbed. Some had tears running down their own faces, though they couldn't have explained why. The music was speaking to something deep inside them, something they'd forgotten was there. Elena swayed gently as she played, her body moving with the rhythm, her face showing every emotion the music demanded. She was somewhere else now, lost in a world where only the piano and the music existed. The audience, the fancy hall, Victor, all of it had disappeared. There was only the sound, only the feeling, only the notes that poured from her fingers like prayers. And as the piece built toward its climax, everyone in that room understood that they were witnessing something rare and precious, something real. The music had completely taken over the room. Every person sat frozen in their seat, afraid that even the smallest movement might break whatever spell Elena had cast. The chandelier light seemed to dim and brighten with the rise and fall of the melody, as if the building itself was responding to her playing. Elena's fingers moved across the keys with a grace that seemed almost impossible. Her hands crossed over each other in complex patterns, dancing from one end of the keyboard to the other without a single hesitation. The difficult passages that made professional pianists nervous flowed from her fingers like water from a fountain. But what made people forget to breathe wasn't the technical perfection. It was the soul she poured into every single note. When the music grew soft and tender, you could hear the longing in it, a sweetness that spoke of beautiful memories and gentle moments. When it swelled into powerful crescendos, you could feel the pain behind it, the kind of deep hurt that changes a person forever. And when it shifted into the dark minor passages, there was a sadness so profound that several people in the audience found themselves crying without understanding why. Victor had moved closer to the stage without realizing it. He stood at the edge of the spotlight's glow, completely transfixed. His trained ear caught every nuance, every subtle choice Elena made in her interpretation. The way she lingered on certain notes just a fraction longer than expected. The way she let some phrases breathe while pushing others forward with urgency. The way she could make the piano whisper one moment and roar the next. This wasn't just excellent playing. This was artistry at the highest level. This was the kind of performance that reminded you why music existed in the first place. A woman in the fifth row pulled a tissue from her purse, dabbing at her eyes. Her husband, a businessman who usually spent concerts checking his email, sat perfectly still, his phone forgotten in his lap. Near the back, an elderly man who had attended thousands of performances in his lifetime leaned forward, his wrinkled hands gripping the seat in front of him. He hadn't heard playing like this in 40 years. The piece moved into its most challenging section, a passage where the right hand plays rapid notes while the left hand carries the melody. It's a section where even accomplished pianists sometimes fumble. Elena played it perfectly, her hands working together like they shared one mind. The notes cascaded and tumbled over each other, creating layers of sound that seemed impossible to be coming from just one instrument. And then came the moment that would be talked about for years afterward. The music built to its emotional peak, the part where everything the composer had been holding back finally breaks free. Elena's whole body lifted slightly off the bench as her hands crashed down on the keys with tremendous force. The sound that emerged was powerful enough to shake the chandeliers. It was anger and grief and defiance all at once. It was the sound of someone who had lost everything crying out to a world that didn't listen. But then, just as quickly, the fury melted into something softer. Her touch became gentle again, almost fragile. The melody turned into a lullaby, a tender goodbye to something precious that could never return. This was the part that broke everyone. This was when the tears really started. Even Victor found his eyes getting wet. He blinked rapidly, trying to maintain his composure, but it was useless. Whatever walls he'd built around himself would have. Her ego and pride he'd wrapped himself in. This music cut right through it all. He felt exposed, vulnerable, like a child again. And in that moment, he understood something about music that all his success and fame had made him forget. Music wasn't about being the best. It wasn't about technique or recognition or standing ovations. It was about truth. It was about touching the deepest parts of human experience and giving them a voice. And this woman, this stranger he'd mocked moments ago, understood that truth in a way he'd lost somewhere along his journey to the top. Elena played the final section with her eyes still closed, tears streaming freely down her face and dripping onto the piano keys. Her hands moved with absolute certainty, even though her whole body trembled with emotion. The music grew quieter and quieter, like a candle slowly burning down. The notes became sparse, delicate, each one placed with such care it felt like she was handling something sacred. The final chord hung in the air, gentle and unresolved, like a question that would never be answered. Elena held it, letting it fade naturally until the sound disappeared into silence. Only then did she lift her hands from the keys. They hovered there for a moment, shaking before falling to her lap. The silence that followed was total and complete. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. It was as if the entire audience had forgotten how to return to the real world. Elena sat at the piano with her head bowed, her shoulders rising and falling with deep breaths. She seemed unaware that hundreds of people were watching her. Or maybe she was aware and simply didn't care anymore. She looked exhausted, like she'd just run a marathon or climbed a mountain. In a way she had. The silence stretched on. 5 seconds, 10 seconds, 15. Then someone in the back row began to clap. Slowly at first, just their hands coming together in steady rhythm. Then another person joined in. Then another. Within seconds, the entire hall erupted into applause so loud it was almost deafening. People leaped to their feet. Some were still crying. Others were shaking their heads in disbelief. The sound of hundreds of hands clapping together echoed off the walls and high ceilings. It wasn't polite applause. It wasn't the kind of clapping people do because it's expected. This was raw, genuine appreciation for something extraordinary they'd just witnessed. "Bravo," someone shouted. Then others joined in. "Bravo, bravo." The word echoed through the hall like a chant. Elena slowly lifted her head. She looked confused, almost startled, as if she'd forgotten where she was. Her eyes swept across the standing crowd, all these wealthy strangers on their feet applauding her with genuine emotion. She stood up from the bench on unsteady legs, looking overwhelmed and lost. Victor was the first person to reach her. He walked onto the stage, his own eyes still red from crying, and for once in his life he had no clever words ready. He just stood there looking at this woman who had somehow shattered his entire worldview in the span of a few minutes. "Who are you?" he asked, and his voice was barely a whisper under the continuing applause. "Please, I need to know. Who are you?" Elena looked at him with those deep, sad eyes. She wiped the tears from her face with the back of her hand. When she spoke, her voice was hoarse, raw from emotion. "My name is Elena Rodriguez," she said simply. "I was a concert pianist, a long time ago." Victor felt like the floor had dropped out from under him. A concert pianist. Of course she was. Nobody played like that without years of professional training and performance experience. But that raised even more questions than it answered. "Was?" he managed to ask. "What happened? Why did you stop?" The applause was finally beginning to die down, though people were still on their feet. Elena glanced out at the crowd, then back at Victor. Her expression was complicated, mixing sadness with something that might have been relief. "That," she said softly, "is a very long story." The hall's director had rushed onto the stage, beaming and gesturing enthusiastically. He was already talking about encores and special performances. People in the front rows were shouting questions and praise. Photographers who'd been hired for the event were snapping pictures frantically. Cell phone videos were already being uploaded to social media, where they would be shared thousands of times before the night was over. But Victor ignored all of it. He looked at Elena with genuine humility for perhaps the first time in years. "Will you tell me?" he asked. "Please, I need to understand." Elena looked at this famous pianist who had asked her to play as a joke, who had accidentally opened a door she'd kept locked for decades. She took a deep breath and nodded slowly. "Yes," she said. "I'll tell you everything." The chaos on stage continued for several more minutes. The event director was practically bouncing with excitement, already talking about booking Elena for future performances. Reporters from local papers pushed forward, calling out questions. People were still taking photos, the camera flashes creating little bursts of light that made Elena squint. Victor gently took her elbow and guided her away from the commotion, leading her down the stage steps and through a side door that most guests didn't know existed. They walked down a quiet corridor where the sounds of the excited crowd faded to a distant murmur. Victor opened another door that led to a small room furnished with comfortable chairs and a coffee table. It was a space the performers used to rest between sets. "Sit, please," Victor said, his voice softer than it had been all evening. He poured 2 cups of coffee from a pot that sat on a warming plate. His hands were shaking slightly as he handed one to Elena. Elena took the cup gratefully, wrapping both hands around it as if she needed the warmth. She sank into one of the chairs, looking completely drained. The adrenaline that had carried her through the performance was wearing off, leaving behind exhaustion that went bone deep. Victor sat across from her, setting his own cup down without drinking from it. He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, and just looked at her for a long moment. There were so many things he wanted to say, so many apologies forming in his mind, but all of them felt inadequate. "I'm sorry," he finally said, "for what I did out there. For putting you on the spot like that. I thought I was being clever and funny, but I was just being cruel. I'm truly sorry." Elena looked at him and gave a small, tired smile. "You didn't know," she said simply. "How could you? I'm just another face in the crowd now. Nobody special." "That's not true," Victor said firmly. "What you did out there, I've been playing professionally for 20 years and I've never heard anything like that. Ever. You're extraordinary." Elena shook her head slowly. "I was extraordinary. Once. A very long time ago." She took a sip of her coffee and stared at the wall for a moment, gathering her thoughts. When she spoke again, her voice was distant, like she was talking about someone else's life instead of her own. "I grew up in Madrid," she began. "My father was a music teacher. Nothing fancy, just someone who taught children their scales and basic pieces. But he loved music more than anything in the world. When I was 4 years old, he brought home an old upright piano. It was beaten up and out of tune, but to me it was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen." A hint of warmth entered her expression at the memory. "I sat at that piano every single day. My father would show me something once, and I could play it back to him immediately. He said I had a gift, but I think I just loved it so much that nothing else mattered. While other kids were outside playing, I was practicing. While they were watching television, I had my hands on those keys." Victor listened without interrupting, recognizing the devotion she described. He'd felt it too once, before success had complicated everything. "By the time I was 15, I'd won every competition in Spain," Elena continued. "I got accepted to the Royal Conservatory in Madrid on a full scholarship. The instructors there said I was the most talented student they'd seen in a generation. Everything happened so fast after that. Competitions across Europe, concert halls, recording contracts. By 25, I was performing in major venues around the world." She paused, her fingers tightening around the coffee cup. "Critics wrote beautiful things about me. They said my playing had something special, something beyond technique. They said I played like I was telling stories that everyone needed to hear, and I believed them. I believed I would play forever. That music would always be there." The warmth in her voice faded. "Then I met Carlos. He was a doctor, kind and gentle and nothing like the intense competitive world I lived in. We got married when I was 28. A year later, we had a daughter, Isabella. She had dark curls and her father's smile and my love for music. I would play for her every night before bed, and she would fall asleep listening to Beethoven and Chopin." Elena's voice cracked slightly, and she stopped to take a breath. Victor remained perfectly still, afraid that any movement might cause her to stop talking. "I tried to balance everything," she went on. "The concerts, the traveling, being a mother and wife. Carlos was so supportive. He would take Isabella with him on his days off so I could practice. My parents would help watch her when I had to travel. We made it work. For 5 years we made it work. Those were the happiest years of my life." She set down her coffee cup with trembling hands. Isabella was 6 years old. Carlos was driving her to her grandmother's house one Saturday afternoon. It was raining. A truck ran a red light at an intersection. Victor's breath caught in his throat. He knew where this was going, but hearing it was different than imagining it. "They died instantly," Elena said, her voice barely above a whisper now. "Both of them. Gone in a second. One moment I had a family, and the next moment I had nothing." Tears rolled down her cheeks, but she made no move to wipe them away. "I couldn't function after that. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't think about anything except that they were gone. My manager tried to get me back on stage after a few months, said it would help me heal, help me move forward. But when I sat at the piano, all I could think about was Isabella falling asleep to my music. All I could see was her little face, so peaceful and happy. Every note I played felt like betrayal. She looked directly at Victor now, her eyes red but clear. I had a complete breakdown. Spent 2 months in a hospital where they tried different medications, different therapies. Nothing worked. Every time I saw a piano, I felt like I was drowning. The thing I loved most in the world had become connected to the worst pain imaginable. So I walked away, Elena continued. I left everything behind. The career, the fame, the contracts, all of it. I moved to a different city where nobody knew who I was. I got a small apartment and a job at a library. For 3 years, I didn't touch a piano. Couldn't even listen to classical music without having panic attacks. Victor wiped at his own eyes. How did you start again? He asked quietly. A small smile touched Elena's lips. Children, she said. I was volunteering at a community center, helping kids with their homework. One day I walked past a room where they kept an old piano. It was out of tune and missing a few keys. A little boy was sitting there, maybe 7 years old, trying to figure out how to play something. He looked so frustrated, so determined. Something in me shifted, she said. I sat down next to him and showed him where to put his fingers. His face lit up when he got it right. That joy, that pure happiness from making music. It reminded me why I'd fallen in love with piano in the first place. Not for the fame or the applause, but for the music itself. I started teaching at the community center after that, Elena explained. Kids whose families couldn't afford real lessons. I kept my past hidden. Nobody needed to know who I used to be. I just wanted to help them find what I'd lost. And slowly, very slowly, I started healing. But you never performed again? Victor asked. Not once in all these years? Elena shook her head. Not until tonight. When you asked me as a joke, something inside me just snapped. Or maybe it opened. I suddenly needed to know if I could still do it. If that part of me was really dead or just sleeping. I had to find out, even if it meant embarrassing myself in front of all those people. She laughed softly, though fresh tears were falling. I guess I got my answer. Victor stood up and paced to the window, looking out at the city lights. When he turned back, his expression was serious. You didn't just answer your question tonight, he said. You reminded everyone in that hall what real music sounds like. You reminded me. He ran a hand through his hair, looking suddenly vulnerable. I've been so caught up in being successful, in maintaining my reputation, that I forgot why I started playing in the first place. You showed me what I've been missing. Elena stood slowly, setting her empty coffee cup aside. I should go, she said. It's late, and I'm sure you have people waiting. Wait, Victor said quickly. This can't be the end. The world needs to hear you play. You're too talented to spend your life in obscurity. I'm not in obscurity, Elena said gently. I'm exactly where I need to be. Teaching kids who love music. That's enough for me. But what about tonight? Victor pressed. What about what you felt up there? Elena was quiet for a moment, considering. Tonight was a gift, she finally said. A chance to say goodbye to who I used to be. To make peace with the past. But my life is different now. And that's okay. She walked toward the door, then paused and looked back at Victor. Thank you, she said. For asking me to play, even if it was meant as a joke. You gave me something I didn't know I needed. As she reached for the door handle, Victor called out one more time. At least let me give you my card. Please, in case you change your mind. Elena took the card he offered and slipped it into her purse. She gave him one last small smile before walking out the door, leaving Victor alone with his thoughts and the sound of distant applause still echoing in his mind. Elena woke up the next morning in her small apartment, sunlight streaming through the thin curtains. For a moment she thought the entire evening had been a dream, but then she saw her black dress draped over the chair, and the business card Victor had given her sitting on her nightstand. It had really happened. She had played in front of hundreds of people for the first time in 23 years. She made herself coffee and sat at her tiny kitchen table, expecting to feel different somehow, changed, but she felt like herself. The same woman who would go to the community center later to teach piano to children who could barely reach the pedals. The same woman who bought groceries at the discount store and took the bus because she didn't own a car. The performance had been beautiful, powerful even, but it was over now. Life would go back to normal, except it didn't. Her phone, which rarely rang except for wrong numbers, started buzzing before she'd finished her first cup of coffee. Unknown numbers. Text messages from people she hadn't spoken to in decades. Someone had recorded her performance and posted it online. The video was spreading like wildfire. By noon, it had been viewed 50,000 times. By evening, over 2 million. By the end of the week, the number had climbed past 50 million. People shared it with comments like, "This made me cry," and "Most beautiful thing I've ever heard," and "Who is this woman?" News outlets picked up the story. Local papers ran headlines like, "Mystery Pianist Stuns Charity Gala," and "Hidden Genius Discovered at High Society Event." Then the bigger papers got involved. Television stations wanted interviews. Music magazines dug into her past and discovered she'd been a rising star who vanished without explanation over 2 decades ago. Elena's phone never stopped ringing. She stopped answering it after the first day. The director of the community center where she taught called her, excited and overwhelmed. "Elena, do you know what's happening? People are showing up here asking about you. Important people. There's a man outside right now from the National Orchestra saying he wants to talk to you." Elena asked him politely to tell everyone she wasn't available. She just wanted to teach her piano lessons and go home. But the attention wouldn't stop. Letters arrived at the community center addressed to her. Formal invitations to perform at concert halls, offers to record albums, requests for interviews. The world, it seemed, had decided that Elena Rodriguez needed to return to professional music, whether she wanted to or not. Meanwhile, something was happening to Victor Ashford that nobody expected, least of all himself. The morning after the charity gala, he woke up and couldn't bring himself to practice. He sat at his own piano in his expensive apartment overlooking the city, placed his hands on the keys and felt nothing. The joy that had once driven him to play for hours every day had disappeared somewhere along the way, replaced by routine and obligation, and the constant pressure to maintain his reputation. Elena's performance had shown him what he'd lost. The raw honesty, the emotional truth, the willingness to be vulnerable through music instead of using it as a shield or a trophy. He called his manager that afternoon. "Cancel the tour," he said. His manager thought he was joking. When Victor insisted he was serious, the man nearly had a heart attack. "You can't cancel a 20-city tour. The tickets are sold out. The contracts are signed. Do you have any idea how much this will cost?" "I don't care," Victor said quietly. "I need time to figure some things out." The cancellation made headlines. Fans were upset. Promoters threatened lawsuits. Music critics wrote articles questioning whether Victor was having a breakdown. His social media filled with concerned messages and angry complaints. But Victor ignored all of it. For the first time in his career, he put himself before his image. He spent his days differently now. Instead of practicing for hours in isolation, he started visiting music schools. Not the prestigious conservatories where he'd trained, but regular public schools in neighborhoods where kids couldn't afford private lessons. He'd sit in the back of classrooms and watch teachers work with students who had more enthusiasm than skill. He saw the joy in their faces when they finally got a difficult passage right. He remembered feeling that way once before everything became about perfection and performance. One afternoon, 3 weeks after the charity gala, Victor found himself standing outside the community center where Elena taught. He'd found the address through persistence and a few well-placed phone calls. He didn't go in right away. Instead, he stood across the street, watching through the window as she worked with a young boy who couldn't have been more than 8 years old. Elena was patient, encouraging, showing him the same passage over and over without a hint of frustration. When the boy finally played it correctly, her face lit up with genuine pride. Victor saw in that moment what Elena had tried to tell him in their conversation. She had found a different kind of success, one that had nothing to do with fame or recognition. He walked into the building and waited in the hallway until Elena's lesson ended. When the young boy left, still glowing with accomplishment, Victor knocked softly on the open door. Elena looked up, surprised. "Victor, what are you doing here?" "I needed to see you," he said. "I need your help." They talked for over an hour. Victor told her about canceling his tour, about feeling lost and disconnected from the music he'd spent his whole life playing. Elena listened without judgment, understanding in a way few others could. "You don't need my help," she told him gently. "You need to remember why you started. Find that child inside you who first fell in love with music, before all the expectations and pressure piled on top." "How do I do that?" Victor asked. "Start playing for the right reasons," Elena said. "Play because the music needs to be played, not because people need to hear you play it. There's a difference." Over the following months, something beautiful began to emerge from that night at the charity gala. Victor didn't return to touring right away. Instead, he started a foundation to bring music education to underprivileged communities. He used his fame and connections not to elevate himself, but to open doors for others. He performed occasionally, but the performances were different now. Critics noted a new depth in his playing, a humility and emotional honesty that had been missing before. And Elena, despite her resistance to the spotlight, couldn't completely escape the impact she'd made. A prestigious music conservatory offered her a position she couldn't turn down. Not as a performer, but as a teacher, artist in residence, they called it. She would teach master classes, mentor young musicians, and occasionally perform if she chose to. She accepted, but on her own terms. She continued teaching at the community center twice a week. Those kids, the ones who came from homes where music was a luxury they couldn't afford, they remained her priority, but now she had a larger platform to advocate for them, to make sure they got opportunities they deserved. Elena did perform again, but selectively. Small venues mostly. Intimate concerts where she could see the faces in the audience. She played at hospitals, bringing music to people who were sick or dying. She performed at a women's prison, showing inmates that transformation was possible. She gave a concert at a school for children with disabilities, adapting pieces so students could join her on stage. Each performance was different from her old life. She wasn't chasing fame anymore. She was using music the way it was meant to be used, as a bridge between human hearts, as a language that spoke when words failed. She also started a scholarship fund. She named it after Isabella and Carlos, finally able to say their names without breaking apart. The fund helped young musicians who had experienced loss or trauma, giving them the support and resources to heal through music the way she had. Victor and Elena became unlikely friends. They would meet for coffee every few weeks, talking about music and life and the strange ways fate worked. Sometimes they performed together at charity events, their contrasting styles creating something neither could achieve alone. Victor's technical brilliance combined with Elena's emotional depth made for performances that people traveled across the country to hear. One evening, almost a year after that fateful night, they sat together backstage after a joint performance. The applause was still echoing from the hall. "Do you ever regret it?" Victor asked. "That I asked you to play that night?" Elena thought about it for a long moment. She thought about the pain of revisiting her past, the invasion of privacy when her story went public, the pressure to return to a life she'd left behind. But she also thought about the healing that had come from it. The closure, the chance to use her gift again in ways that mattered. "No," she said, finally smiling. "I don't regret it. Sometimes we need someone to push us, even if they're doing it for the wrong reasons. You opened a door I'd kept locked for too long." "I'm sorry, it was meant as a joke," Victor said, "not for the first time." "I know," Elena replied, "but maybe that's the point. God works in mysterious ways. Even our mistakes, our moments of arrogance or cruelty, can become catalysts for something beautiful." "You didn't know you were giving me a gift." "But you were." Victor nodded slowly, understanding more than he ever had before about music, about life, about the unexpected ways people change each other. Outside, someone was calling for them to take another bow. The audience wanted to see them one more time. They stood together and walked back onto the stage. Two people who had been transformed by a single moment, a single performance, a single question asked in jest that changed everything. The applause washed over them like waves. But neither of them needed it the way they once had. They had found something more valuable than fame. They had found purpose. They had found truth. And they had found their way back to the music that had always been waiting patiently for them to remember why it mattered. Elena looked out at the crowd and thought about her daughter, about her husband, about the life she'd lost and the different life she'd found. She thought about the children she taught, the musicians she mentored, the people whose lives were touched by her playing. And for the first time in 23 years, she felt at peace with all of it. The pain and the joy, the loss and the discovery, the ending and the new beginning. This was her story now, and it was far from over.